He was a man haunted by loss. She was a woman the world refused to love. Their marriage was never meant to be real, just a cold bargain for survival. But on a frozen mountain where death waits at every corner, can two wounded hearts learn to trust again? Welcome to a channel where we share Western stories of love, sacrifice, motherhood, and the beauty of human kindness. This story reminds us, love often finds us when we least believe we deserve it. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. Thank you for being part of our community.
The stagecoach lurched to a violent halt, the wooden wheels sinking deep into the ruts of Silver Creek. Eleanor Vance gripped the handle of her battered carpet bag, her knuckles stark white against the worn leather. Inside that bag lay everything she owned in the world: 3 faded dresses, a volume of Shakespeare, and 7 carefully folded letters of rejection. 7 men, 7 different towns across the frontier. 7 times she had been told she was too tall, too plain, too sharp-tongued, or simply too much trouble to keep. Eleanor took a breath of the biting autumn air and stepped out of the carriage. The town of Silver Creek was nothing more than a jagged wound of civilization cut into the base of the unforgiving Montana mountains. Men in dust-caked canvas coats stopped on the boardwalks to stare. Women sweeping the porches of the saloon and the assayer's office paused, their eyes tracking the new arrival with predatory curiosity. Eleanor lifted her chin. She was 25, destitute and desperate, but she was still a Vance of Boston. She reached for the wooden step of the stagecoach, her foot searching for solid ground. Instead, the hem of her worn taffeta dress caught on a jagged iron nail protruding from the carriage frame. The fabric tore with a sickening rip. Eleanor lost her balance. She pitched forward, arms flailing, and hit the ground hard. She didn't land on dirt. She landed face first in a churning, freezing trough of red mountain mud and horse manure. For a second, the street was dead silent. Then a raw, barking laugh erupted from the saloon porch. It spread like wildfire. A dozen men and women joined in, pointing at the mail-order bride struggling to push herself up from the filth. Eleanor's chest tightened, a familiar, humiliating burn crawling up her throat. Mud dripped from her eyelashes. Her dark hair, painstakingly pinned up that morning, hung in ruined, heavy ropes around her pale face. She didn't cry. She had run out of tears 3 towns ago. She simply grabbed her carpetbag, her hands shaking, and forced herself to stand. Through the blur of mud and humiliation, her gaze flicked to the shadows beneath the general store awning. A man stood there, leaning against a wooden post. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet of corded muscle and weather-beaten leather. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, but a jagged, pale scar cut a vicious line from his cheekbone to his jaw. He wore a heavy wolf pelt coat that made him look more beast than human. He was the only person on the street who wasn't laughing. The glowing red cherry of a cigar clamped between his teeth flared as he took a slow drag. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, locked onto hers. There was no pity in that stare. It was cold, assessing, and heavy enough to make her breath catch. Eleanor broke the gaze, squaring her shoulders as she dragged her ruined dress through the muck toward the town hall. By dusk, the mud had dried to an itchy, cracking crust on her skin, and her last shred of hope had evaporated. "I'm sorry, Miss Vance," the town councilman had said, not looking sorry at all. "But a schoolmarm must be a pillar of absolute respectability. Word travels fast on the telegraph line. We know about your failed arrangements. A woman sent back 7 times is not the sort of influence we want for our children." Starvation was a highly effective motivator. It drove Eleanor to the back door of the Garrett boarding house, where the terrifying, iron-spined widow Garrett offered her the only job available, mucking the stables. Now Eleanor stood knee-deep in soiled straw, her back screaming in agony as she drove a pitchfork into the muck. Her hands, meant for holding ink pens and turning the pages of philosophy books, were already tearing open. Blisters rose and burst against the rough wooden handle of the pitchfork, leaving bloody smears on the wood. She gritted her teeth, shoving the heavy manure into a wheelbarrow. "I am alive," she told herself. "I am breathing. I will not starve." When the stalls were finally cleared, her stomach let out a hollow, painful cramp. She had 1 silver dime left in her pocket. It was enough for a sliver of lye soap and a heel of bread. She limped out of the barn and made her way down the darkening street to the general store. The air had turned bitterly cold, biting through her damp, ruined dress. Inside, the store smelled of coffee beans, cured tobacco, and kerosene. Eleanor hovered near the back, waiting for the proprietor, a greasy-haired man named Dawson, to finish with his current customer. The customer was Toby, the young, half-starved stable boy from the boarding house. Toby was clutching a small sack of flour and a tin of beans, nervously placing a handful of copper and silver coins on the counter. "That's 80 cents, boy," Dawson sneered, sweeping the coins into his thick palm. "You're short." "I ain't short, Mr. Dawson," Toby stammered, his eyes wide. "Widow Garrett gave me exactly 80 cents. 2 quarters, 2 dimes, and 10 pennies. "I only count 60 here, you little rat," Dawson lied smoothly, dropping the coins into his lockbox with a heavy clack. "Put the beans back." Toby looked like he was about to cry. Eleanor's exhaustion vanished, replaced by a cold, searing rage. She stepped out of the shadows, her boots thudding heavily against the floorboards. "He gave you 80 cents, Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the quiet store like a razor. Dawson looked up, his lip curling in disgust as he took in her mud-stained clothes and bruised face. "Mind your business, beggar." "Mathematics is my business," Eleanor snapped, stepping right up to the counter. She didn't flinch. She leaned in, her gray eyes locking onto Dawson with lethal precision. 2 quarters is 50 cents. The boy handed you 2 dimes, bringing the sum to 70. I watched you slide 10 copper pennies across the glass with your left thumb. That is 80 cents. Furthermore, a sack of flour currently trades at 45 cents on the Denver Exchange, not 50. You are overcharging him by a nickel and stealing 20 cents from a child. Dawson turned red. "Listen here, you crazy spinster. If you do not return the beans to this boy and give him his nickel in change," Eleanor interrupted, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper, "I will walk straight to the assayer's office and inform them that your hanging scale is rigged. The left chain is 3 links shorter than the right, creating a permanent tilt. You've been shaving weight off gold dust for months." Dawson froze. The color drained from his face. He stared at the mud-caked woman, realizing with dawning horror that she possessed an intellect sharp enough to gut him. Without a word, he shoved the tin of beans at Toby and slammed a nickel onto the counter. "Go, Toby," Eleanor said softly. The boy grabbed his supplies and bolted. Eleanor didn't buy her bread or soap. Dawson was looking at her like she was a venomous snake, and she had no desire to hand him her last dime. She turned on her heel and walked out into the freezing night. She made it exactly 3 steps down the boardwalk before a massive shadow detached itself from the alleyway, blocking her path. Eleanor gasped, stumbling back. It was the man from the awning. The man in the wolf pelt coat. Up close, he was terrifying. He smelled of pine needles, leather, and gunpowder. The scar on his face was a jagged, pale lightning bolt in the moonlight, and his eyes were completely unreadable. "You didn't flinch," his voice rumbled. It was deep, scraping like stones grinding together in a riverbed. Eleanor swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. She tightened her grip on her carpetbag. "Step aside, sir." He didn't move. He looked down at her bloody, blistered hands, then up to the fierce, unyielding pride burning in her eyes. "You're the mail-order bride they sent back 7 times, he stated. It wasn't a question. Eleanor lifted her chin, refusing to let him see how the words slashed at her pride. "If you are looking for entertainment, you will have to find someone else to laugh at." I wasn't laughing, the man said softly. He took a single step closer. The sheer heat radiating from his massive frame fought back the chill of the Montana wind. They said you were too sharp for your own good. They said no man in his right mind would want a woman who talks back and can't cook a decent meal. Eleanor glared at him, her body rigid with defensive fury. Then it is a good thing I do not require a man's approval to survive. The corner of his scarred mouth twitched upward, the ghost of a brutal, knowing smile. You're the woman no one wants, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous gravel. Good. Because I'm the man everyone fears. The freezing Montana wind howled through the gaps in the stable boards, a relentless reminder that Eleanor Vance was completely, utterly alone. She lay on a thin bed of scratchy hay in the back of Widow Garrett's barn, her teeth chattering so violently her jaw ached. She had wrapped her ruined taffeta dress as tightly around her shivering frame as she could, but the damp mud caked into the fabric only seemed to draw the cold deeper into her bones. She did not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the glowing ember of the mountain man's cigar and the chilling, unreadable depths of his storm-gray eyes. I'm the man everyone fears. When the bruised purple light of dawn finally crept through the slats, Eleanor forced herself to rise. Her muscles screamed in protest. The blisters on her hands had wept and crusted over during the night, leaving her palms stiff and burning. She had no food, no money, and no prospects, but she possessed a stubborn, unbreakable pride that refused to let her die in a pile of horse manure. She spent the morning mucking the remaining stalls, her breath pluming in the frigid air. By noon, Widow Garrett handed her a single stale biscuit and a cup of tepid water. Eleanor ate it methodically, forcing her stomach to accept the meager offering without rebelling. It was mid-afternoon when the real trouble found her. Eleanor was carrying a heavy wooden bucket of water from the town pump toward the stables. The alleyway behind the saloon was narrow, stinking of stale beer and rotting garbage. She was halfway down the corridor when 3 men stepped out from the back door of the tavern, effectively blocking her path. The man in the center wore a tailored wool suit that looked entirely out of place in the mud-soaked squalor of Silver Creek. He had slick, pomaded blonde hair, a neatly trimmed mustache, and a smile that did not reach his cold, reptilian eyes. Well now, the man purred, stepping forward. His polished leather boots avoided the worst of the mud with practiced ease. If it isn't the infamous mail-order bride, I heard Silver Creek had inherited a Boston cast-off. Eleanor set the heavy bucket down. Her heart kicked against her ribs, but she kept her spine rigid. Excuse me, I have work to finish. Work? The man laughed, a dry, rasping sound. His 2 thugs, mountainous men smelling of cheap whiskey and unwashed bodies, chuckled along with him. Shoveling horse shit for the Widow Garrett isn't work, sweetheart. It's charity. And in my town, charity doesn't last long. Your town? Eleanor asked, her voice deliberately flat, betraying none of the panic rising in her throat. Marcus Riggins, he introduced himself, tipping his bowler hat with mock politeness. I own the bank, the assayer's office, and just about every mortgage in this miserable valley, which means I own the law. And the law says vagrants don't get to loiter in Silver Creek without visible means of support. Riggins took a step closer, crowding her against the rough, splintered wood of the saloon wall. The smell of him, expensive cologne masking the sharp tang of liquor, made Eleanor's stomach turn. I've seen those hands of yours, Miss Vance. You're no pioneer woman. You'll freeze to death before November, Riggins murmured, his gaze dropping to the torn neckline of her muddy dress. But I'm a generous man. I run an establishment upstairs. Warm beds, good food. All you have to do is be agreeable to the miners who come into town looking for a little comfort. A smart, educated girl like you could make a very profitable living. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, replaced instantly by a scorching, blinding fury. I would sooner freeze to death in the street than sell myself to a vile, opportunistic parasite like you. Riggins's smile vanished. His eyes went dead. "You stupid, arrogant bitch. You think you have choices? By sundown, the sheriff will throw you in the county jail for vagrancy. And once you're in my jail, you'll beg me for that job upstairs." He reached out, his gloved hand moving to grab her jaw. Eleanor didn't scream. She reached into the bucket of freezing water, intending to hurl it directly into his smug face. She never got the chance. A shadow fell over the alley, blocking out the pale afternoon sun. It happened so fast, Eleanor barely registered the movement. A massive, fur-clad arm reached past her. A hand the size of a dinner plate clamped onto the back of Riggins's tailored collar, jerking him backward with such violent force that the land baron's boots left the ground. Before Riggins's two enforcers could even draw their weapons, the mountain man moved. Silas Thorne didn't bother unholstering his revolver. He simply swung the heavy, solid walnut stock of his Winchester rifle in a brutal horizontal arc. The wood connected with the jaw of the closest thug with a sickening crack of shattering bone. The man collapsed into the mud like a puppet with its strings cut, out cold before he hit the ground. The second thug froze, his hand trembling above his holster as he stared down the dark, yawning barrel of the Winchester that Silas had seamlessly leveled at his chest. "Touch that iron and I'll paint this wall with your lungs," Silas rasped. His voice was terrifyingly calm, completely devoid of the adrenaline that usually accompanied violence. Riggins scrambled backward in the mud, his expensive suit ruined, his face pale with terror and rage. He looked up at the towering, scarred trapper. "Thorne," Riggins spat, wiping a speck of mud from his lip. "You're a dead man. You hear me? The judge is signing the papers tomorrow. You're going to be declared legally unfit, a feral menace to the territory. That mountain spring will be mine, and you'll hang if you try to stop my surveyors." Silas didn't blink. The jagged white scar on his cheek stood out in stark relief against his dark beard. "If your surveyors cross my tree line, I won't shoot to kill, Marcus. I'll shoot them in the gut and let the wolves drag them off while they're still screaming. Now get out of my sight before I decide to break your neck just for the quiet." Riggins sneered, backing away slowly. "Tomorrow, Thorne. Enjoy your last night of freedom." He gestured to his remaining terrified thug, who dragged his unconscious partner by the collar out of the alley. Silence descended on the muddy corridor, broken only by the ragged sound of Eleanor's breathing. Silas slowly lowered the rifle. He turned his imposing frame toward her. For a moment he just looked at her, his storm-gray eyes analyzing the way she was shaking. Not from fear, but from the massive adrenaline crash. Without a word, his large, calloused hand wrapped around her upper arm. His grip was entirely inescapable, though not bruising. "Hey!" Eleanor protested. "Walk!" he commanded, dragging her forward. He pulled her out of the alley and into the cavernous, dimly lit interior of Widow Garrett's barn. The air was thick with the smell of hay, leather, and horse sweat. He released her only when they were deep in the shadows, far from prying eyes. Eleanor stumbled back against a wooden support beam, her chest heaving. She glared up at him, refusing to cower even though he stood a full foot taller and outweighed her by 100 pounds of solid muscle. "I did not ask for your assistance," she snapped, her voice trembling slightly. "You were about 5 seconds away from getting your jaw broken," Silas replied coldly. He leaned his rifle against a stall door and crossed his arms over his chest. "Riggins isn't a man who takes no for an answer. He's a parasite who feeds on desperate people. And you, Miss Vance, are the most desperate thing in this territory." Eleanor bristled. "What do you want from me?" Silas studied her. He took in the sharp, intelligent angles of her face, the defiant set of her jaw, and the way she held herself with the rigid posture of a wealthy aristocrat, despite being covered in horse manure. "Riggins owns the valley," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that vibrated in the quiet barn. "But I own the high mountain. I hold a federal claim to 500 acres of timber and the only fresh water spring that doesn't dry up in August. Riggins needs that water to expand his cattle empire. He's tried to buy me out. He's tried to shoot me out. Neither worked." So he is using the law, Eleanor deduced instantly, her sharp mind connecting the dots of the alleyway confrontation. He said the judge was going to declare you legally unfit. A flicker of genuine surprise and respect crossed Silas's eyes. You catch on fast. I am highly educated, Mr. Thorne. It is precisely why 7 men found me unsuitable to be a compliant housewife. She lifted her chin. How can a judge take your land? I've lived alone on that mountain for 8 years. I don't come to town. I don't socialize. Riggins has bribed a district judge to issue a ruling that I'm a feral lunatic, a danger to the territory, and incapable of managing the property. Under the Homestead Disputes Clause, if a man is deemed mentally unstable and has no family to steward the land, the state can seize it and auction it off. Silas's jaw tightened, the scar tissue pulling taut. Riggins will buy it for pennies on the dollar. Eleanor stared at him, the pieces falling into place. You need a wife. I need a shield, Silas corrected. A judge cannot declare a man an unstable, feral beast if he is legally married to a respectable, educated woman from a prominent eastern city. A wife proves stability. It proves intention to settle. It ruins Riggins's entire legal argument. I am destitute, Eleanor pointed out, her voice barely a whisper. I am a laughingstock. You are a Vance of Boston, Silas countered, stepping closer. The sheer heat radiating from him was palpable in the freezing barn. You speak 3 languages. You can do complex mathematics in your head. You have the kind of aristocratic arrogance that makes local politicians nervous. To a corrupt territorial judge, you look like a woman who could write a letter to a senator and cause a lot of trouble. You are exactly the kind of respectable armor I need. Eleanor felt the barn spinning slightly. This wasn't a proposal. It was a tactical military alliance. And what do I get? She demanded. You get to live, Silas said bluntly. You get a roof over your head. You get food in your belly. You get my absolute protection from Marcus Riggins and anyone else in this miserable town who thinks they can lay a hand on you. He paused, his eyes narrowing. But the mountain is brutal, Eleanor. It's isolated. The winter up there kills weak things. It drives people mad. I will not pamper you, and I will not coddle you. He took another step, invading her personal space. He loomed over her, a dark, dangerous force of nature. He needed to know she wouldn't break when the first blizzard hit. He needed to test the steel beneath her fragile-looking exterior. Silas leaned down, his face mere inches from hers. His voice was a harsh, terrifying rasp. I need to know you won't snap when the snow traps us in for 3 months. I need to know you're not going to weep and beg to be sent back to this mud hole. So tell me, Miss Vance. He let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating. Will you give me sons? Eleanor's breath caught. The question was a physical blow, a crude, shocking demand that stripped away all pretense of civility. He was asking her to commit to the most primal, permanent bond imaginable, to surrender her body and her future to a man she had met yesterday. She looked into his eyes. She didn't see lust. She saw a cold, ruthless test. He expected her to slap him. He expected her to run. He expected her to be just like the 7 men who had rejected her, terrified of the harsh reality of the frontier. Eleanor felt a fire ignite in her chest, burning away the humiliation, the cold, and the fear. She was done running. She was done letting men dictate her worth. She didn't back away. She leaned in, her gray eyes blazing with a ferocity that matched his own. I will give you a fight you won't forget, Mr. Thorne, she whispered fiercely. I will survive your mountain, and I will survive you. But if you ever speak to me like a broodmare again, I will wait until you are asleep and smother you with your own wolf pelt. For a long, tense moment, neither of them breathed. Then Silas Thorne did something she hadn't expected. He smirked. It was a small, dangerous curving of his lips, a look of profound, primal satisfaction. She had passed the test. He reached into his heavy leather coat and pulled out a solid gold double eagle. He tossed it through the air. Eleanor's reflexes, honed by years of catching books tossed by her scholarly father, flared to life. She snatched the heavy coin out of the air. "Buy a heavy coat. Get some food in you and wash the mud off your face," Silas commanded, turning his back on her and picking up his rifle. He pushed the barn door open, letting the freezing wind howl back into the shadows. He didn't look back as he stepped out into the dying light. "I'll be at the sheriff's office. We marry at dawn." The morning sun had barely crested the jagged peaks of the Rockies when Eleanor Vance walked into Dawson's general store. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful sound that felt entirely out of place in the grim reality of her morning. She had spent the night scrubbing her skin raw with ice-cold water at the boarding house pump, washing the mud and the stench of the stables from her hair. She wore her least damaged dress, a dark navy wool that was slightly frayed at the cuffs but serviceable. Dawson looked up from his ledger, his eyes widening in shock as she approached the counter. He clearly remembered her threat from the day before. Without a word, Eleanor slammed the heavy gold double eagle onto the glass counter. The thud made Dawson jump. "I require a heavy winter coat, wool lined with sheepskin," Eleanor stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "A pair of sturdy leather boots, size 6, 2 pairs of thick woolen stockings, and a clean linen chemise." Dawson stared at the gold coin as if it were a mirage. $20 was a fortune in Silver Creek. It was a month's wages for a miner. Where did you get this?" he stammered. "That is none of your concern," Eleanor said, her gray eyes flashing dangerously. "I suggest you fetch the items before I decide to take my business. And this coin elsewhere." Within 10 minutes, Eleanor was stepping out of the store. The heavy, sheepskin-lined canvas coat swallowed her slender frame. But for the first time in days, she felt warmth seeping into her bones. The new leather boots were stiff, biting into her heels. But they were a vast improvement over her ruined velvet slippers. As she walked down the muddy boardwalk toward the sheriff's office, she could feel the eyes of the town upon her. Word had spread. In a place like Silver Creek, a physical altercation involving Marcus Riggins and Silas Thorne was the equivalent of a theatrical performance. The townspeople whispered behind their hands, staring at the mail-order bride who had somehow gone from mucking stalls to carrying gold. She ignored them. She kept her spine straight and her eyes fixed forward. The sheriff's office was a cramped, utilitarian building that smelled of stale coffee, gun oil, and old sweat. When Eleanor pushed the door open, the tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Sheriff Miller, a balding man with a nervous twitch in his left eye, sat behind his desk, shuffling a stack of papers with trembling hands. Standing by the barred window, blocking out the morning light, was Silas Thorne. He had shed the heavy wolf pelt, revealing a dark woolen shirt that stretched tightly across his broad shoulders and thick chest. He wore a holster low on his right thigh, the dark wood handle of a heavy Colt revolver polished smooth from use. He looked less like a groom and more like an executioner waiting for the order to drop the axe. He didn't smile when Eleanor entered. His storm-gray eyes swept over her, taking in the heavy coat and the clean, pinned-up hair. He gave a single curt nod of approval. "Let's get this done," Silas said, his voice rumbling in the small room. Sheriff Miller swallowed hard, wiping a sheen of sweat from his forehead with a dirty handkerchief. "Now, Silas, you know this is highly irregular. Without the reading of the banns, without a preacher. You are a magistrate of the territory, Miller. You have the legal authority to sign a marriage certificate," Silas interrupted, stepping away from the window. The sheer size of him seemed to shrink the room. "And you're going to sign it right now. Unless you want me to bring Riggins in here and we can discuss exactly how much he's paying you to look the other way when he steals land." Miller paled. He practically scrambled for his inkwell. "No need for that, Silas. No need at all. I have the forms right here." He slid a piece of heavy parchment across the desk. It was a standard territorial marriage contract, cold and bureaucratic. "Stand together," Miller instructed nervously. Eleanor stepped up beside Silas. He was so tall that the top of her head barely reached his shoulder. The heat radiating from his body was a stark contrast to the freezing draft coming through the window. "Do you, Silas James Thorne, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Miller asked, rushing through the words as if he feared a gunshot might interrupt him. "I do," Silas said. The words sounded like a vow made on a battlefield. "And do you, Eleanor Vance, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Eleanor looked at the piece of paper. This was it. The final severing of her past. There was no romance here, no flowers, no music, no promises of eternal love. This was a transaction of survival. She was trading her freedom for protection and a roof over her head. She was binding herself to a man who lived like a wolf on a frozen mountain. She thought of the 7 letters in her bag. She thought of Riggins' slimy smile in the alleyway. She lifted her chin. "I do." "Sign here," Miller said, thrusting a pen toward them. Silas took the pen first. His large, scarred hand gripped the delicate wooden instrument awkwardly, but his signature was bold, dark, and unwavering. He handed the pen to Eleanor. Her hand shook slightly as she pressed the nib to the paper. Eleanor Vance. In a few strokes of ink, that woman ceased to exist. She was now Eleanor Thorne. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I pronounce you man and wife," Miller said, looking incredibly relieved that it was over. "You may... well, you're married." Silas didn't attempt to kiss her. He didn't even touch her. He simply took the marriage certificate, folded it with meticulous care, and slid it into the inner pocket of his coat. "The wagon is out front," he said to Eleanor. When they stepped out of the sheriff's office, Eleanor stopped dead in her tracks. Standing on the boardwalk across the muddy street was Marcus Riggins. He was smoking a thin cigar. His eyes narrowed in a look of pure, unadulterated hatred as he stared at Silas and Eleanor. He had lost this round, but the venom in his posture promised a war. Silas didn't break stride. He walked straight to a heavy, weather-beaten buckboard wagon hitched to 2 massive, shaggy draft horses. Toby, the stable boy, was struggling to load Eleanor's battered trunk into the back. Silas casually reached over with one hand, grabbed the heavy trunk by the leather handle, and hoisted it into the wagon bed as if it weighed no more than a sack of feathers. He flipped a silver dime to Toby, who caught it with a gasp of gratitude. Silas turned to Eleanor. He placed his large hands on her waist, his grip firm, entirely impersonal and shockingly strong, and lifted her up onto the high wooden bench of the wagon. He climbed up beside her, took the heavy leather reins in his scarred hands, and clicked his tongue. The draft horses surged forward. They left Silver Creek behind without a backward glance. For the first hour, the ride was merely uncomfortable. The wagon rattled violently over the rutted valley road, jolting Eleanor's teeth together. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was vast, filled only by the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves and the creaking of wood. But as the wagon turned off the main trail and began the steep ascent into the Rocky Mountains, the reality of her decision began to set in. The landscape transformed with terrifying speed. The muddy, open plains of the valley gave way to dense, claustrophobic forests of towering lodgepole pines. The air grew thinner, sharper, carrying the distinct metallic scent of impending snow. The temperature plummeted. Even wrapped in her new sheepskin coat, Eleanor began to shiver. The wind howled through the trees, a lonely, desolate sound that made her feel infinitely small. She glanced sideways at the man who was now her husband. Silas sat perfectly still, his eyes scanning the tree line with the hyper-vigilance of a predator. He seemed entirely immune to the biting cold. The jagged scar on his face was a stark white against his wind-burned skin. He was a creature of this harsh, unforgiving world, and she was an alien who had just landed on a hostile planet. "It's getting colder," Eleanor noted, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to control it. "Storm's coming early," Silas replied, not looking at her. "We need to beat it to the ridge." He cracked the reins, urging the massive horses into a grueling uphill march. By the third hour, the sky bruised into an angry, bruised purple. The first flakes of snow began to fall, not gentle, drifting flakes, but hard, icy pellets that stung Eleanor's cheeks like tiny needles. The trail narrowed until it was barely wider than the wagon axles. To her left, the mountain rose in a sheer wall of dark rock. To her right, the ground dropped away into a terrifying abyss, a deep gorge choked with mist and jagged pines. One wrong step by the horses, one slip of the wooden wheels, and they would plunge to their deaths. Eleanor gripped the wooden edge of the bench so tightly her fingers ached. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. She had read about the frontier and the safety of her father's Boston library. She had read about the majestic mountains and the brave pioneers. The books had lied. There was no majesty here. There was only raw, brutal survival. "Keep your eyes on the horses' ears," Silas commanded suddenly, his voice cutting through the rising howl of the wind. Eleanor blinked against the driving snow. "What?" "Don't look at the drop. Don't look at the sky," he ordered, his tone brokering no argument. "Look at the horses' ears. If they're flicking back and forth, they're calm. If they're calm, you're safe. Focus on the ears." Eleanor forced her gaze forward, locking her eyes onto the dark, twitching ears of the massive draft horse on the right. She breathed in sync with the animal's heavy, rhythmic snorts. Slowly and credibly, the panic began to recede, replaced by a numb, focused endurance. They drove for another 2 hours through the worsening blizzard. The world was reduced to a blinding swirl of white. Eleanor lost all sense of time and direction. She was frozen, her toes completely numb inside her new boots, her eyelashes heavy with ice. Just as she thought she could not endure another moment, the trees broke. The wagon pulled into a wide, snow-covered clearing nestled in a natural bowl near the peak of the mountain. In the center of the clearing stood a cabin. It was a fortress built of massive hand-hewn pine logs, chinked tight with mud and mortar. A heavy stone chimney rose from the side, capped with a layer of snow. Beside the cabin stood a sturdy barn and a large corral, all fortified against the elements. It was isolated, utterly cut off from the rest of humanity. Silas pulled the horses to a halt. He didn't wait for her. He jumped down into the knee-deep snow, unhitched the exhausted horses with rapid, practiced movements, and led them toward the barn. "Go inside," he shouted over the wind, pointing to the cabin. "Doors unlatched." Eleanor scrambled down from the wagon, her frozen legs nearly giving out beneath her. She waded through the heavy snow, her breath tearing at her throat, and pushed against the heavy oak door of the cabin. It swung open, revealing an interior of profound darkness, smelling of cold ash and old pine. She stepped over the threshold, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. A moment later, Silas emerged from the blizzard, carrying her heavy trunk on his shoulder. He stepped inside, his massive frame blocking the fading, snowy light of the doorway. With a swift, decisive motion, Silas swung the heavy oak door shut. Thud. The sound echoed in the dark cabin with absolute finality. Silas reached out and dropped a massive forged iron latch into place. The heavy metallic clack seemed to reverberate in Eleanor's very bones. She stood in the center of the dark, freezing room, listening to the wind scream against the log walls. She looked at the towering, scarred silhouette of the man she had just married. The truth hit her with the force of an avalanche. She had not escaped her fate. She had simply traded the humiliating cage of civilization for a far more dangerous one. She was locked on top of a mountain, completely cut off from the world, trapped in a dark room with a wolf. And the key was already buried under 3 feet of snow. Morning on the mountain did not arrive with the gentle golden hues of a Boston sunrise. It arrived like a blade sliding under the door. Eleanor woke shivering, her breath forming small white clouds in the dim, freezing air of the cabin. She was lying on a narrow cot in the corner, huddled beneath 2 heavy wool blankets that smelled faintly of wood smoke and wet dog. Across the room, the large bed built into the wall was empty. Silas was already gone. She pushed the blankets aside, gasping as the frigid air bit through her linen chemise. The fire in the great stone hearth had burned down to gray ash and a few stubborn, glowing embers. Eleanor dressed frantically, her fingers clumsy and stiff as she buttoned her wool dress and pulled on her heavy boots. She stood in the center of the cabin, finally taking in the reality of her new prison. It was a masculine, utilitarian space, entirely devoid of comfort. Heavy iron skillets hung from a rack. A rack of rifles and skinning knives dominated one wall. There were no curtains, no rugs, no books. It was a shelter meant for surviving, not living. Her stomach gave a hollow, painful twist. If she wanted to eat, she had to cook. And to cook, she needed a fire. How difficult could it be? She had read treatises on thermodynamics and the principles of combustion. Half an hour later, Eleanor sat back on her heels, coughing violently, as thick, acrid gray smoke billowed from the cast-iron stove. She had stuffed it with pine needles, damp bark, and too many heavy logs, choking the draft completely. Her eyes watered, stinging fiercely, and her hands were smeared with black soot. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, leaving a dark streak across her cheek, and tried to fan the smoke away with a tin plate. The heavy oak door swung open, letting in a blast of freezing wind. Silas stood in the doorway. A massive stack of split firewood balanced effortlessly on his shoulder. He took one look at the smoke-filled cabin, the ruined fire, and Eleanor kneeling on the floor, looking like a defeated chimney sweep. He didn't sigh. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He simply dumped the wood into the iron bin with a deafening crash, walked over to the stove, and roughly shoved her aside. "You're smothering it," Silas rasped. He grabbed a heavy iron poker, hauled out the smoking, damp logs, and expertly arranged a lattice of dry kindling over the glowing embers. Within 30 seconds, a bright, crackling flame roared to life. Eleanor stood up, her face burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the fire. "I was managing." Silas stood to his full height, towering over her. His storm-gray eyes swept over her soot-stained dress and trembling, blistered hands. "Philosophy doesn't chop wood, Eleanor. Reciting poetry won't draw water from a frozen creek, and knowing 3 languages won't stop you from starving to death when the flour runs out. I have never been taught how to manage a cast-iron stove," she fired back, her pride stinging. "If you would simply instruct me, I don't have time to be a schoolmaster." Silas cut her off, his voice a low, hard rumble. "Winter is here. Every second of daylight is spent keeping us alive. You figure it out or you go hungry." He turned on his heel, grabbed a heavy iron bucket, and walked back out into the blizzard, slamming the door behind him. Eleanor stood frozen, her nails digging into her palms. The sheer, suffocating reality of her uselessness crushed down on her. She had spent her entire life cultivating her mind. She could debate the merits of transcendentalism, but here on this brutal mountain, her intellect was a worthless currency. Determined not to be a burden, she set to work. She found a slab of salt pork and a tin of oats. She placed a cast-iron skillet over the open flame, dropping the pork into it. She turned away for what felt like only a moment to fetch water from an indoor barrel. By the time she turned back, the cabin was filling with a new, distinct smell: burning grease. She lunged for the skillet, grabbing the iron handle with her bare hand. A sharp, searing hiss of burning flesh filled the air. Eleanor screamed, dropping the skillet. It clattered against the stone hearth, splattering boiling black grease across the floor and ruining the meat. She collapsed against the wooden table, clutching her blistering hand to her chest, tears of sheer agony and frustration finally spilling over her lashes. She hated this mountain. She hated the cold. Most of all, she hated the scarred, ruthless man who had brought her here. When Silas returned, the cabin smelled of charred meat and failure. He looked at the spilled grease, then at Eleanor, who was wrapping her burned hand in a torn strip of linen, her jaw clamped shut to keep from crying out. He walked to the larder, pulled out a piece of hardtack and a strip of dried venison jerky, and tossed them onto the table in front of her. "Eat," was all he said. The next 3 days blurred into a grueling, agonizing cycle of physical labor and silent humiliation. Eleanor stubbornly refused to ask for his help. She learned to manage the stove through brutal trial and error, burning her forearms and singeing her eyelashes. She learned to fetch water from the creek, a task that required her to haul a heavy iron axe through knee-deep snow and chop through 4 inches of solid ice while the wind whipped her face raw. Every night, she collapsed onto her narrow cot, her body trembling with exhaustion, her muscles screaming, her hands a landscape of blisters, burns, and cracked, bleeding skin. And every night, Silas sat by the fire, sharpening his skinning knives or repairing snowshoes in absolute suffocating silence. He watched her struggle. He watched her fail. But he never offered a hand, and he never offered a word of pity. He was forging her in the fire of the mountain, testing the limits of her endurance. On the 4th morning, Eleanor woke with a profound sense of dread. The wind outside was shrieking, rattling the heavy wooden shutters. Her hands throbbed with a dull, sickening ache. She looked at her raw, bleeding palms and didn't know how she would hold the axe today. She dragged herself out of bed, shivering violently, and walked to the wash basin, steeling herself for the agonizing task of punching through the layer of ice that formed over the water every night. But when she looked down, she froze. The ice in the basin had already been shattered. A fresh, steaming pitcher of hot water sat beside it. And resting neatly on the rough wooden table next to the basin was a pair of gloves. Eleanor reached out hesitantly, her bruised fingers brushing the material. They were made of supple, cured deer hide, lined with thick, incredibly soft rabbit fur. The stitching was meticulous, heavy, and undeniably masculine. She slipped her trembling hands into them. They fit her slender fingers perfectly. The soft fur immediately soothed her raw, blistering skin, encasing her hands in a cocoon of warmth. She turned, looking toward the door. Silas was already gone, out checking his trap lines in the blizzard. He hadn't said a word. He hadn't offered a grand apology for his harshness. But as Eleanor stared at the hand-stitched leather, she realized that Silas Thorne spoke an entirely different language. His words were cruel, but his hands provided. He had spent hours in the dead of night, after she had gone to sleep, carefully measuring and sewing these gloves to protect her. A strange, unfamiliar warmth bloomed in Eleanor's chest, fighting back the chill of the cabin. That night, the blizzard intensified, transforming the world outside into a howling void of white. Eleanor lay in her cot, wearing the fur-lined gloves even as she slept. Across the room, Silas was a large, dark shape in his bed, the dying embers of the fire casting long, dancing shadows across the log walls. Deep in the dead of night, the sound of the wind was pierced by a sudden, violent gasp. Eleanor jolted awake. Across the room, Silas was thrashing in his bed. The heavy wool blankets were tangled around his legs. His massive chest heaved, slick with sweat despite the freezing temperature of the cabin. "No," Silas choked out, his voice a raw, ragged tear in the darkness. "No, please." Eleanor sat up, her heart pounding. The man who had faced down Marcus Riggins' thugs without blinking, the man who seemed immune to pain and cold, was trembling violently. "Silas?" she whispered, unsure if she should approach him. He violently twisted, his hand reaching out into the empty air, grasping for something that wasn't there. "Sarah!" he screamed, the name ripping from his throat with such profound, shattering agony that it made the hair on Eleanor's arm stand up. "Sarah, hold him! Don't let go!" He bolted upright, his chest heaving, his storm-gray eyes wide and blind in the darkness. He stared at the empty space beside his bed, his breath coming in jagged, ragged gasps. Eleanor held her breath, pressing herself against the log wall, her heart breaking at the sheer, devastated sound of his voice. Slowly, Silas realized where he was. He dragged a shaking hand down his scarred face, the illusion breaking. He dropped his head into his hands, his broad shoulders shaking in the silent, oppressive darkness of the cabin. Eleanor pulled her blankets up to her chin, the soft fur of her new gloves brushing her cheek. She stared at the broken man across the room, the terrifying mountain trapper who was haunted by ghosts he could not outrun. Sarah. The name echoed in her mind. Silas had not brought her to this mountain to be a wife. He had brought her here because she wasn't Sarah. And as the wind screamed outside, Eleanor realized with a chilling certainty that the true danger of this mountain was not the cold, nor the starvation, nor Marcus Riggins. The true danger was the fortress Silas Thorne had built around his shattered heart. For 3 days following the nightmare, a calcified silence settled over the cabin. Silas withdrew entirely, becoming little more than a ghost who chopped wood, checked trap lines, and stared into the fire with blank, unreadable eyes. He spoke only in grunts and curt commands. Eleanor didn't press him. She recognized the sharp, jagged edges of grief. She simply wore the gloves he had made her, tended to the fire, and slowly, painstakingly mastered the rhythm of survival. On the 4th evening, the blizzard finally broke. The wind died down to a low, mournful whistle, and a fragile, icy moonlight spilled across the snow-choked clearing. The temperature, however, plunged to a lethal, brittle low. Eleanor was standing by the stove, carefully stirring a pot of venison stew, when the sound tore through the quiet night. It was a scream, high-pitched, frantic, and entirely unnatural. Silas bolted up from the table, his chair crashing to the floor. "The horses!" He didn't grab his heavy coat. He snatched his Winchester rifle from the wall rack, kicked the heavy oak door open, and plunged out into the freezing night, wearing only his woolen shirt. Eleanor grabbed a kerosene lantern, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, and ran to the open doorway. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. She held the lantern high, the yellow light barely piercing the darkness. From the direction of the barn came the terrifying sounds of a violent struggle, the heavy thud of hooves kicking against wooden stalls, a low, guttural snarl that vibrated in Eleanor's chest, and then the deafening roar of Silas's rifle. Bang! The gunshot echoed off the mountain peaks, followed by a sickening sound of tearing wood and a furious feline screech. "Silas!" Eleanor screamed into the darkness. Silence descended, heavy and terrifying. For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing moved. Then, a massive shadow detached itself from the gloom of the barn. Silas stumbled out into the moonlight. He took 3 steps through the knee-deep snow before his knees buckled. He collapsed forward, his rifle dropping from his hands, his face burying into the white drift. "No!" Eleanor dropped the lantern on the porch and lunged into the snow. She reached him, grabbing his good shoulder to roll him over. Her hands came away slick, wet, and warm. Blood. So much blood. The left side of his woolen shirt was shredded. 4 deep, jagged claw marks started at his collarbone and tore diagonally across his chest and shoulder. The cougar, driven mad by starvation, had ambushed him in the dark. "Silas, get up," Eleanor pleaded, grabbing his thick arms. "You cannot stay here. You will freeze." His eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused with shock and blood loss. He groaned, a low animal sound, and tried to push himself up. With Eleanor straining with every ounce of strength she possessed, she managed to haul his massive arm over her shoulder. Together they dragged his staggering, bleeding frame through the snow and over the threshold of the cabin. Silas collapsed onto the wooden floor near the hearth, his breathing shallow and ragged. The pool of dark blood spreading beneath him looked black in the firelight. Panic, sharp and blinding, clawed at Eleanor's mind. She was miles from civilization. There was no doctor. If she didn't act, the man she had married a week ago would bleed to death on the floor. "Focus," she commanded herself. "Intellect is not useless here." Her father's Boston library hadn't merely held volumes of Shakespeare and Greek philosophy. It had contained heavy, leather-bound texts on anatomy, frontier medicine, and pharmacology. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, forcing her panicked brain to recall the precise clinical diagrams of the human circulatory system. Subclavian artery, cephalic vein, hemostasis. "Silas, stay awake," she ordered, her voice shedding its tremor, adopting the cold, precise tone of a scholar. She ran to the stove, grabbing the kettle of boiling water. She threw a handful of clean rags into a tin basin, dousing them in the scalding water. She darted to the supply shelf, her eyes scanning the jars until she found it. A small brown apothecary bottle of carbolic acid. Dilute to a 5% solution to prevent necrosis of the tissue, her mind recited the pharmacological text flawlessly. She poured a precise measure of the acid into the hot water, the sharp, medicinal stench instantly filling the cabin. She grabbed a sewing needle, a spool of thick, waxed linen thread, and a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey. She knelt beside Silas. He was frighteningly pale, his lips taking on a bluish tint. With a pair of shears, she cut away the ruined, blood-soaked wool of his shirt, exposing the massive expanse of his chest. The wounds were horrifying, deep trenches of torn flesh and muscle. Thankfully, the cougar's claws had narrowly missed the major arteries, but the bleeding was still severe. "This is going to hurt," Eleanor warned, her voice steady. Silas's jaw clenched, his storm-gray eyes locking onto hers. "Do it." She poured the raw whiskey directly into the open wounds. Silas roared, his massive body arching off the floor in agony, his hands curling into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She threaded the needle with hands that had suddenly ceased to shake. She was no longer a useless aristocrat. She was a machine of survival. She began to stitch. She pushed the steel needle through his tough, weather-beaten skin, pulling the torn flesh together, tying tight, precise surgical knots. 1 stitch, 2, 10, 20. The coppery tang of blood and the sharp bite of carbolic acid hung heavy in the air. Silas didn't scream again. He lay rigid, his breathing a harsh hiss through his teeth, his eyes never leaving her face. He watched her work with a dark, intense focus, absorbing her fierce, unwavering competence. By the time she tied off the final stitch on his shoulder, her hands were cramped and slick with his blood. She had closed the worst of the wounds. Silas let out a long, shuddering breath, his head falling back against the wooden floor. He had passed out from the sheer, overwhelming pain. Eleanor sat back on her heels, swiping a bloody forearm across her sweating forehead. She needed bandages. Clean, dry linen to bind his chest tightly and stop any residual seeping. She looked around the cabin. Her own meager dresses were too dirty or too thin. She looked toward Silas's bed. At the foot of the heavy wooden frame sat a massive, iron-bound trunk. He kept it locked, but the keys were hanging on a peg near the door. Eleanor scrambled up, grabbed the heavy brass keyring, and knelt before the trunk. She turned the lock. With a heavy clack, the lid sprang loose. She threw it open, expecting to find spare woolen shirts or canvas trousers. Instead, the top layer of the trunk was filled with pristine, carefully folded linen sheets. They were of exceptional quality, edged in delicate lace, entirely incongruous with the brutal life of a mountain trapper. Eleanor reached in to grab a sheet. As she pulled the fabric away, something hard and wooden clattered to the bottom of the trunk. She froze. Beneath the linens, hidden away in the dark, was a small velvet-wrapped bundle. Her hands trembling, Eleanor reached down and pulled the bundle out. The velvet fell away, revealing 3 objects. The first was a small, intricately carved wooden horse. It was a child's toy, worn smooth from the grip of tiny hands, the edges charred and blackened by fire. The second was a silver daguerreotype case. Eleanor clicked it open. Inside was a photograph of a woman with a gentle smile and kind eyes, holding a plump, laughing toddler on her lap. The third object was a leather-bound journal. The cover was heavily burned, the pages curled and warped by heat and water. Eleanor opened it carefully. The handwriting inside was elegant, looping, and distinctly feminine. November 4th, 1870, the entry read, "The snow is early this year. Thomas has a terrible cough. Silas says he will ride down the mountain tomorrow to fetch medicine from town, but I fear the pass is already blocked. I told him not to worry, that we will keep the fire warm. But I am afraid." Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat. Sarah. The woman from the photograph, the woman from his nightmare. Thomas, the little boy holding the wooden horse. She looked up from the trunk, her gaze drawn to the frosted glass of the cabin window. The moonlight illuminated the snowy clearing. Near the edge of the tree line, framed by two ancient pines, were two small, perfectly symmetrical mounds of snow. They were not rocks. They were not stumps. They were graves. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with devastating, heartbreaking clarity. 8 years ago, Silas had a family, a wife he loved, a son he cherished, and they had died on this mountain, trapped by the snow, perhaps while he was desperately trying to save them. The fire that had charred the toy and the journal, a desperate attempt to stay warm, an accident in the dark. Eleanor dropped the journal, her hands covering her mouth as a profound, hollow ache tore through her chest. She understood now. She understood everything. Silas hadn't chosen her just because she was a Vance of Boston who could impress a corrupt judge. He hadn't chosen her because she was brave, or because she stood up to Marcus Riggins. He had chosen her because she carried 7 rejection letters. He had chosen her because she was plain, pragmatic, sharp-tongued, and utterly unromantic. He had chosen a woman he was absolutely, completely certain he could never fall in love with. Silas Thorne's heart was a fortress, barricaded by grief and guilt. He needed a legal wife to keep his land, but he refused to ever risk the agony of losing someone he loved again. So he had intentionally sought out a transaction, a cold, loveless bargain with a desperate spinster. She wasn't a partner. She was a legal shield, guaranteed not to touch his soul. Eleanor looked back at Silas lying unconscious and bleeding on the floor. Her husband, a man who had built a cage of ice around his chest and locked her inside it with him. Tears, hot and bitter, finally spilled over Eleanor's eyelashes, tracking through the soot and blood on her face. She was a survivor. She had proven that tonight. But surviving wasn't living, and as she tore the pristine linen sheet into strips to bandage the wounds of a man who would never allow himself to love her, Eleanor realized that the coldest thing on this mountain wasn't the winter snow. It was her marriage. Silas Thorne woke to the smell of carbolic acid and the dull, throbbing agony of torn muscle. He opened his eyes, the heavy lids feeling like they were coated in sand. The cabin was cast in the pale gray light of mid-morning. He lay on his own bed, his chest bound so tightly in pristine white linen that every shallow breath was a battle. He turned his head. Eleanor sat at the rough-hewn table, perfectly straight, her hands folded in her lap. She wore her faded navy wool dress, her hair pinned up in its usual severe style, but her gray eyes were utterly changed. The fear and uncertainty that had shadowed them since she arrived in Silver Creek were gone. In their place was a flat, glacial emptiness that chilled him deeper than the mountain wind. Between them, resting squarely in the center of the table, was the charred, velvet-wrapped journal. Next to it lay the silver daguerreotype and the blackened wooden horse. Silas's blood ran cold. He tried to sit up, a feral growl of warning tearing from his throat. But the agony in his shoulders slammed him back down against the mattress. "Do not move," Eleanor said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, completely devoid of the tremor he had come to expect. "You lost nearly 2 pints of blood. The sutures will tear if you strain the pectoralis major." Silas ignored the medical terminology, his storm-gray eyes fixing on the items on the table. "You went into my trunk." "I needed clean bandages to keep you from bleeding to death on the floor," she replied, her tone clinical and detached. "I found your ghosts instead." Silas's jaw clenched, the scar on his cheek pulling taut and white. "Put them back, now." Eleanor didn't flinch. She picked up the small, charred wooden horse, turning it over in her blistered, healing hands. "Her name was Sarah, and your son was Thomas. They died 8 years ago." "I said put them back, Eleanor." The shout tore at his chest, raw and ragged. She set the toy down gently. She met his furious gaze, and the profound, devastating sorrow in her eyes made his breath catch. "You did not marry me to save my life, Silas," she said softly. the truth hanging in the frigid air between them like a drawn blade. And you did not marry me just to satisfy a corrupt territorial judge. You married me because of the 7 letters in my carpetbag. Silas turned his face away, staring at the log wall. He said nothing. You looked at me, Eleanor continued, her voice trembling now, not with fear, but with a profound, shattering heartbreak. And you saw a woman who was plain, argumentative, and utterly unlovable. You saw a woman who had been rejected by 7 different men because she lacked warmth and grace. You chose me, Silas, because you were absolutely certain that you could never, ever fall in love with me. Silence blanketed the cabin, heavier than the snow piling up against the shutters. When Silas finally looked back at her, his eyes were bleak, empty voids. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. Love, Silas spat, the word tasting like poison on his tongue. Love makes you weak, Eleanor. It makes you blind. It makes you leave your cabin in the middle of a blizzard because you think you can beat the mountain to fetch medicine for a coughing child. Love is what leaves you digging through 6 feet of collapsed snow with your bare, bleeding hands, only to find the hearth cold and your world dead. He glared at her, his chest heaving against the tight linen bandages. You want romance? You read too many of your father's books. Up here, romance gets you killed. I needed a wife to hold this land. You needed a shield against Riggins. It was a transaction. It was always a transaction. I promised you protection and food. I never promised you my heart. Eleanor stood up slowly. The vulnerability vanished from her face, replaced by a mask of cold, unbreakable, aristocratic pride. You are right, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper of pure ice. It is a transaction. But do not mistake my lack of beauty for a lack of dignity. I will be your legal shield, and I will maintain this homestead. But I will not be a captive audience to your self-pity. She turned and walked to the corner of the room, dragging a heavy folded canvas tarp from beneath a stack of supplies. With a fierce, jerky determination, she dragged a wooden chair to the center of the room. Reaching up to the exposed ceiling beams, she began to hammer heavy iron nails into the wood, stringing a thick rope across the exact center of the cabin. Silas watched in grim silence as she hauled the heavy canvas up, draping it over the rope. With a final decisive pull, the heavy fabric fell, completely dividing the small one-room cabin in half. Silas was left on the side with the bed and the hearth. Eleanor claimed the side with the stove, the supply larder, and her narrow cot. The physical wall was drawn. The Cold War had begun. Over the next 2 weeks, as Silas's shoulders slowly healed, the canvas barrier became an instrument of exquisite psychological torture. Eleanor spoke to him only when absolutely necessary, and only regarding matters of survival. We need more firewood. The flour is running low. The horses have been fed. But her silence did not mean she surrendered. Quite the opposite. Driven by a furious need to prove she was not merely a useless transactional object, Eleanor transformed. Every morning, before the sun even crested the peaks, Silas would hear the heavy thud of the door. He would drag himself out of bed, peek through the frosted window, and watch his aristocratic Boston wife standing in knee-deep snow. She had taken his spare Winchester rifle from the rack. She spent hours outside in the biting cold, her shoulders bruised black and blue from the rifle's brutal recoil, teaching herself to shoot. She missed the targets, tree stumps and dead branches, dozens of times. But she never cried. She simply reloaded, adjusted her stance, and fired again, until the sharp crack of the rifle was followed by the satisfying shatter of splintering wood. When she wasn't shooting, she was at the chopping block. Silas watched in agonizing silence as she hefted the heavy iron axe, her slender arms trembling with the effort. She missed the sweet spot of the logs repeatedly, jarring her wrists, but she refused to stop until a formidable pile of firewood was stacked against the cabin wall. Silas sat by the hearth, nursing his healing shoulder, his mind violently at war with itself. His plan had been flawless. Marry a cold, pragmatic spinster, secure the land, keep his heart safely entombed in the ice of the past. But his plan was failing spectacularly. The canvas tarp drove him mad. He couldn't see her, but he could hear everything. He heard the soft rustle of her wool dress as she moved about her chores. He heard the quiet, rhythmic sound of her breathing at night. He smelled the scent of lye soap, wood smoke, and the faint, natural sweetness of her skin that permeated the small space. She was supposed to be unlovable. But as he watched her drag a slain snowshoe hare through the door, her face flushed with the exertion of the hunt, her gray eyes burning with fierce, unyielding competence, Silas felt a terrifying, white-hot knot of desire tighten in his gut. She was magnificent. She was fire and steel disguised in mud-stained wool. He didn't just admire her survival. He craved her. He wanted to tear down the canvas wall. He wanted to cross the room, pin her against the log timber, and feel the fierce beating heart beneath her ribs. He wanted to taste the defiance on her lips. Late one evening, the tension reached a breaking point. Silas was pacing his side of the cabin like a caged predator. Eleanor was on her side, reading a worn book by the light of a single kerosene lantern. The silhouette of her profile was cast sharply against the canvas tarp. Silas stopped in the center of the room. He reached out, his scarred knuckles grazing the rough fabric of the canvas, hovering mere millimeters from where the shadow of her face rested. On the other side, Eleanor's shadow went perfectly still. She didn't pull away. For one agonizing minute, they stood on opposite sides of the barrier, separated by a millimeter of canvas and a chasm of pride. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy with unspoken need and suppressed electricity. Silas closed his eyes, his breathing ragged. He curled his hand into a fist and let it drop to his side. He turned and walked back to his bed, the silence screaming in his ears. He had built this wall. But as the wind outside began to howl, signaling the approach of the worst storm of the decade, Silas knew the wall was going to kill them both. The great blizzard of 1878 hit the mountain 2 days before Christmas, not with a whisper, but with the concussive force of a runaway train. By noon, the sky was a bruised, impenetrable black. The wind screamed with a deafening, demonic pitch, ripping shingles from the barn roof and driving snow against the cabin shutters with the force of buckshot. By midnight, the temperature inside the cabin plummeted to a lethal, unimaginable low. Eleanor lay curled on her narrow cot, wearing every piece of clothing she owned, including the heavy sheepskin coat and the fur-lined gloves Silas had made her. It wasn't enough. The cold was a living, breathing entity, sinking its teeth into her marrow. Her violent shivering had stopped an hour ago, a terrifying medical sign she recognized from her anatomy texts. Hypothermia was setting in. Her blood was slowing, her organs preparing to shut down. On the other side of the canvas, the fire in the great stone hearth was losing the battle. The draft from the chimney was pulling the heat straight out into the storm faster than the wood could burn. Suddenly, the violent sound of tearing fabric ripped through the dark cabin. Eleanor gasped, her sluggish eyes flying open. Silas tore the heavy canvas tarp from the ceiling beams with a single brutal pull, the iron nails shrieking as they were ripped from the wood. He threw the fabric to the floor, crossing the room in 3 massive strides. "Get up," he commanded. In the dim, dying light of the fire, he looked terrifying. His chest heaved, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked carved from granite. I can't," Eleanor slurred, her lips numb, her body refusing to obey the signals from her brain. Silas didn't hesitate. He reached down and hauled her up into his arms, lifting her as easily as a child. He carried her across the room and dropped her onto his large, feather-stuffed bed near the hearth. "Take the coat off," he ordered, rapidly shedding his own heavy outer layers until he was in his woolen union suit. "The wool is freezing. We need skin-to-skin contact, or you are going to die in the next hour." Eleanor's frozen fingers fumbled uselessly at the heavy horn buttons of her coat. "Let me," Silas rasped, his voice dropping an octave. His large, scarred hands brushed hers aside. He unbuttoned the heavy coat, peeling it off her shivering frame. He didn't stop there. With efficient, clinical speed, he unfastened the stiff bodice of her navy wool dress, pulling it over her head until she was left shivering in her thin cotton chemise and woolen stockings. Eleanor gasped as the frigid air hit her. But a second later, a massive, overwhelming wave of heat enveloped her. Silas pulled her down into the center of the bed, dragging 3 layers of heavy bear and wolf pelts over them both. He pulled her flush against his chest, his large arms wrapping around her, cocooning her against his massive, radiating body heat. "Hold on to me," he whispered fiercely into her hair. Eleanor pressed her face into the crook of his neck, her freezing hands resting flat against the hard, muscular expanse of his chest. Beneath her palm, she could feel the steady, thundering beat of his heart. She shook violently against him, her teeth chattering, but slowly, miraculously, the agonizing numbness began to recede. His body was a furnace, driving the lethal cold from her bones. They lay locked together for hours as the blizzard raged outside, the heavy log walls of the cabin groaning under the immense pressure of the snow. In the pitch-black darkness beneath the firs, stripped of their armor and their pride, the silence between them changed. It was no longer a battlefield. It was a confessional. It was an avalanche. Silas's voice broke the silence. It was a raw, jagged whisper tearing from deep within his chest. Eleanor went perfectly still, her breath catching. "Thomas had a fever," Silas continued, his arms tightening around her trembling frame as if she were his only anchor to the earth. "I left them with plenty of wood. I rode out to get medicine, but the snow on the high pass gave way. A wall of white, 50 feet high. It buried the trail, buried my horse. It took me 3 days to dig myself out and climb back up the ridge on foot." Eleanor closed her eyes, a tear slipping hot against his skin. She could see it in her mind's eye, the desperate, freezing man tearing at the mountain with his bare hands. "When I got back," Silas's voice cracked, a devastating sound of pure, unadulterated agony. The roof had caved under the weight of the snow. The hearth fire was smothered. They were huddled in the bed, frozen. I was supposed to protect them, Eleanor. I was their husband, their father. And I let the mountain take them. He buried his face in her hair, his massive body shaking with the force of 8 years of repressed, suffocating grief. Eleanor didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault, because grief did not listen to logic. Instead, she shifted. She wrapped her arms around his broad, scarred back, pulling him tighter against her. She held him with a fierce, unwavering strength, absorbing his pain, anchoring him to the present. "I am here, Silas," she whispered fiercely. "I am here, and I am not letting the mountain take me." Silas pulled back slightly, looking down at her in the dim, glowing embers of the firelight. His storm-gray eyes were wet, stripped of all their terrifying feral armor. He looked at her not as a transaction, not as a legal shield, but as the woman who had brought fire back to his frozen world. He raised a trembling hand, his rough, calloused thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. "I chose you because I thought you were cold," Silas murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. "I thought you were safe. I was a fool. You are the most magnificent, terrifying fire I have ever known." Eleanor's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Silas." "I don't want a shield anymore, Eleanor," he breathed, leaning in, his lips hovering mere millimeters from hers. "I want my wife." Eleanor closed the distance. The kiss was an explosion. It wasn't gentle or hesitant. It was desperate, hungry, and entirely consuming. Silas's mouth was hot and demanding, tasting of grief and salvation. Eleanor kissed him back with a ferocity that matched his own, her hands tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer, erasing the months of bitter silence and cold war. The physical need that had been simmering between them for weeks finally boiled over. Silas shifted his weight, his large hands sweeping down her sides, learning the curves she had hidden beneath heavy wool. He was infinitely careful, treating her with a reverence that belied his massive strength, as if she were something precious that he was terrified of breaking. But Eleanor didn't want careful. She wanted the storm. She pulled the linen chemise over her head, baring herself to him in the dim firelight. Silas let out a ragged groan, his hands tracing the line of her collarbone, his mouth following the path of his fingers. Every touch was electric, driving the last remnants of the winter chill from her blood. When they finally came together, it was a fierce, life-affirming collision of two souls who had survived the worst the world had thrown at them. In the heart of a deadly blizzard, on an isolated mountain, they found warmth, forgiveness, and a profound, terrifying love. They clung to each other as the wind screamed, anchoring themselves in the heat of the present, finally letting the ghosts of the past rest. When Eleanor woke, the air in the cabin was still freezing, but she was cocooned in a profound, lingering warmth. The howling wind had stopped. An eerie, absolute silence had fallen over the mountain. Silas was not in the bed. Eleanor sat up, clutching the fur pelt to her bare chest. Silas stood fully dressed by the frosted window. He had scraped away a circle of ice and was staring intently out at the valley far below. His posture was rigid, the terrifying feral tension back in his broad shoulders. "Silas?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Is the storm over?" He didn't turn around. His jaw was clenched, the scar white against his cheek. "The storm is over," Silas said softly. His hand dropped to the heavy Colt revolver strapped to his thigh, his thumb brushing the hammer. But the war just started. Eleanor scrambled out of bed, wrapping a blanket around herself, and hurried to the window. She peered through the circle of clear glass, following his gaze down the sheer drop of the mountain, toward the vast, snow-covered expanse of the valley. Far below, distinct and black against the pristine white snow, 3 thick columns of smoke were rising into the clear morning sky. They weren't from chimneys. They were massive, oily plumes of burning timber. "Riggins," Silas rasped, his eyes narrowing into lethal slits. "He's burning out the lower homesteaders. We're next." Spring did not arrive on the mountain with a gentle thaw. It came with a violent, rushing roar. The heavy snowpack melted into torrents of freezing water that swelled the creeks and tore massive boulders from the mountainside. Beneath the retreating white, the earth was raw, black, and aggressively alive. Green shoots of mountain grass punched through the mud, and the air grew thick with the sharp scent of pine sap and wet soil. Inside the cabin, the heavy canvas tarp had been burned in the hearth months ago. Eleanor stood at the rough-hewn table, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows, kneading a heavy mound of bread dough. Her hands were no longer the soft, blistered appendages of a Boston aristocrat. They were strong, calloused, and capable. She moved with a newly discovered rhythm, completely in tune with the harsh demands of the homestead. A sudden, violent wave of nausea hit her. Eleanor gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white as the cabin spun dizzily. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to take slow, measured breaths until the bile retreated from her throat. It was the 3rd morning in a row. She pressed a flour-dusted hand flat against her lower abdomen. Her monthly courses had not arrived since the worst week of the blizzard. Her mind, forever analytical, quickly calculated the weeks, the symptoms, and the undeniable, terrifying conclusion. The heavy oak door swung open, letting in a gust of crisp spring air. Silas stepped inside, carrying a freshly skinned brace of rabbits. His dark hair was damp with sweat, the sleeves of his woolen shirt pushed up to reveal thick, scarred forearms. When his storm-gray eyes found her, the hard, feral lines of his face softened into something entirely vulnerable. "You're pale," Silas noted instantly, tossing the rabbits into a tin basin. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his large hands cupping her face. His calloused thumbs brushed her cheekbones. "Are you ill? The fever?" "No," Eleanor whispered. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. She looked up into the eyes of the man she had married in a cold, transactional bargain, the man she now loved with a fierce, consuming intensity. She took a breath, deciding there was no gentle way to deliver the truth. "I am not ill, Silas. I am with child." For a span of 3 heartbeats, absolute silence reigned in the cabin. Silas's hands froze on her face. Eleanor watched, expecting to see a spark of joy, or perhaps the pragmatic satisfaction of a man who had secured his legal heir. Instead, she watched the blood completely drain from his face. His pupils dilated until his eyes were almost entirely black. The jagged scar on his cheek stood out in stark, terrifying relief. He pulled his hands away from her as if she had burned him, stumbling back a step. "No," Silas rasped. It wasn't a denial of the fact, it was a desperate, panicked plea to the universe. "Silas?" Eleanor reached out, confused and hurt by his reaction. He turned away, pacing toward the hearth like a caged animal. His chest heaved. "It's too early. The winter was too hard on you. You're too thin, Eleanor. You don't know what it takes to birth a child up here without a doctor. You don't know the blood, the complications." "Women have children every day," Eleanor argued, her voice firm. "I am stronger than I look. You know this." As Silas whirled around, his eyes blazing with a raw, naked terror that broke her heart. "Sarah was strong, and the mountain took her. It took them both." He gripped the mantle of the stone hearth so hard the wood groaned. "I cannot bury you, Eleanor. If I lose you, I will not survive it. I will burn this entire mountain to ash, and myself with it." He wasn't rejecting the child. He was terrified of the cost. The trauma of his past had risen up like a phantom, choking the joy from his throat. Eleanor crossed the room. She didn't offer empty comforts. She grabbed his thick wrists, forcing his white-knuckled grip off the mantle. She pressed his massive, trembling hands flat against her stomach. "Listen to me," she commanded, her gray eyes locking onto his with unbreakable resolve. "I am not a ghost. I am not a memory. I am your wife. I survived your winter. I survived your silence. I will survive this." Silas stared down at her, his jaw trembling. He slowly sank to his knees, burying his face against her abdomen, his massive arms wrapping around her waist as he let out a ragged, shuddering breath. "I will keep you safe," he swore into the rough wool of her dress, the vow sounding like a threat to God himself. "No matter what comes up that trail." What came up the trail did not wait for summer. It happened 3 nights later. The moon was hidden behind a thick bank of storm clouds. Eleanor awoke to the sound of Silas moving swiftly and silently in the dark. He wasn't having a nightmare. He was wide awake, fully dressed, and strapping his heavy Colt revolver to his thigh. "Silas?" Eleanor whispered, sitting up. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice a lethal, barely audible hiss. He grabbed the Winchester rifle from the wall. "Someone is outside." Before Eleanor could process the words, a brilliant, unnatural orange glow erupted through the frosted glass of the cabin window. Whoosh! The smell of kerosene and burning dry rot instantly infiltrated the cracks of the logs. "The barn!" Eleanor gasped. Silas kicked the door open. The night was illuminated by a terrifying inferno. Marcus Riggins hadn't waited for the corrupt judge. He had sent his men up the mountain to burn Silas out before the spring melt made the trail widely accessible. 3 men on horseback were circling the barn, throwing lit torches onto the hay-strewn roof. Inside the burning structure, the draft horses and the mules screamed in panic. "Don't come out!" Silas roared at Eleanor. He leveled the Winchester and fired. The sharp crack of the rifle echoed over the roar of the flames. One of the riders screamed, tumbling from his saddle into the mud. The other 2 men immediately returned fire, their revolvers flashing in the dark. Bullets thudded heavily into the thick logs of the cabin wall. Silas dove behind the heavy wooden water trough on the porch, laying down suppressive fire. But the barn was catching fast. In 5 minutes, the roof would collapse, burning the animals alive and spreading the fire to the cabin. Eleanor didn't stay down. She rolled out of bed, her bare feet hitting the freezing floorboards. She grabbed her own heavy winter coat, shoved her feet into her boots, and reached for the second rifle on the rack. A lighter, lever-action repeater Silas had taught her to shoot during the Cold War of the winter. She filled her pockets with spare cartridges and ran to the door. Silas was pinned down. Every time he tried to break cover to run toward the barn doors to free the animals, a hail of bullets forced him back. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She stepped out onto the porch, bracing the rifle against the heavy wooden door frame. She took a breath, remembered her winter training, sighted down the barrel at the muzzle flashes in the dark, and squeezed the trigger. Bang! A man's hat flew off into the darkness, accompanied by a shout of shock. Bang! Bang! Eleanor racked the lever with smooth, mechanical precision, firing repeatedly, forcing the riders to scatter and take cover behind a cluster of boulders. "Eleanor, get back inside!" Silas bellowed over the gunfire. "Free the horses!" she screamed back, ignoring him. Her eyes narrowed against the smoke. "I will cover you! Go!" Silas looked at her, standing in the glow of the fire, her hair wild, her eyes like gray steel, laying down cover fire with the cold precision of a soldier. He didn't argue. He broke from cover and sprinted across the muddy clearing toward the burning barn. Eleanor kept firing, her shoulder bruising with every kick of the rifle, keeping the mercenaries pinned down. Silas reached the heavy barn doors, hauling them open. The panicked draft horses surged out into the night, their hooves churning the mud, narrowly escaping the burning roof. Seeing their primary target saved and facing heavier resistance than anticipated, the remaining mercenaries broke. They scrambled onto their horses and galloped blindly down the treacherous, muddy mountain trail, abandoning their wounded comrade in the snowmelt. The gunfire ceased, leaving only the deafening roar of the burning barn. "Buckets!" Silas roared, sprinting toward the creek. Eleanor dropped the rifle and grabbed the heavy iron pails from the porch. For the next hour, they fought a grueling, desperate battle against the flames. They hauled freezing water from the creek, their lungs burning with smoke and exertion, working in perfect, unspoken tandem. By the time the sun began to bleed over the horizon, the fire was dead. Half the barn's roof was gone, the timber charred and smoking, but the structure stood, and the cabin was safe. Eleanor dropped her empty bucket into the mud. She was covered in black soot, her hands blistered anew, her chest heaving. She collapsed against the side of the water trough, sliding down until she was sitting in the cold mud. Silas walked over to her. His face was a mask of ash and sweat. He looked down at the woman who was carrying his child, the woman who had just engaged in a midnight firefight, and hauled 50 gallons of water to save their livelihood. He didn't yell at her for risking her life. He dropped to his knees in the mud beside her. He reached out, his large, trembling hands pulling her against his chest. "You didn't flinch," he whispered, burying his face in her smoke-scented hair. "I told you," Eleanor breathed, wrapping her arms around his thick neck. "I am going to give you a fight you won't forget." Silas pulled back, his storm-gray eyes locking onto hers. The terror that had gripped him days ago was gone, replaced by a fierce, unshakable awe. "They will come back," Silas said grimly, looking toward the trail. "Riggins won't stop until he has the deed, or we are dead." Eleanor rested her hand on her abdomen, her chin lifting with that familiar, unbreakable, aristocratic pride. "Then let him come," she said coldly. "We have a mountain to defend." By late August, the mountain was a pressure cooker. A suffocating, oppressive heat wave had settled over the Rockies, baking the earth until it cracked. The air was thick, heavy with the metallic taste of impending violence and the suffocating humidity of a looming storm. Eleanor was in her 9th month. Her belly was heavy, her center of gravity entirely shifted. Her ankles swelled, and the persistent ache in her lower back was a constant reminder that their time was running out. Silas barely slept. He spent his days fortifying the cabin, boarding up the lower halves of the windows, stockpiling ammunition, and boiling clean water. When the weather finally broke, it didn't rain. The sky simply tore open. A torrential, apocalyptic downpour slammed into the mountain. The dry, cracked earth couldn't absorb the deluge. Within hours, the serene creeks turned into raging, muddy rivers. Inside the cabin, Eleanor stood by the stove, trying to brew willow bark tea to ease her backache. Suddenly, a sound like a freight train echoed through the valley. The ground beneath the cabin shook violently. Silas threw open the heavy oak door, peering through the sheets of driving rain. "Mudslide!" he shouted over the roar of the storm. "The main trail is gone. Half the ridge just washed away." Eleanor dropped her tin cup. It wasn't the sound of the mudslide that made her gasp. It was the sudden, vicious tearing sensation low in her abdomen, a pain so sharp and absolute it stole the breath from her lungs. She gripped the edge of the stove, her knuckles white. Water, warm and entirely separate from the rain, rushed down her thighs, pooling on the wooden floorboards. Silas turned back from the door, his eyes dropping to the puddle at her feet. The color vanished from his face. "Eleanor," he breathed. "It is time," she gasped, her legs buckling as a second agonizing contraction ripped through her body. Silas caught her before she hit the floor. He lifted her effortlessly, carrying her to the large bed near the hearth. His hands were shaking, but his voice remained steady, a practiced calm masking his absolute terror. "I've got you. I've got you," he chanted, pulling the blankets back. He grabbed clean linens, the shears, and the basin of boiled water he had prepared days ago. "Silas!" Eleanor gritted out, her fingernails digging into his forearm as another wave of pain consumed her. "The trail is gone. We are trapped." "I am here. You don't need a doctor. You are strong," Silas promised, kissing her sweaty forehead. But the mountain was not done with them. Over the deafening roar of the rain, the sharp, unmistakable crack of a gunshot echoed through the clearing. A bullet shattered the top pane of the window, embedding itself in the log wall just inches above the bed. Silas shoved Eleanor down flat against the mattress. He lunged for his Winchester, killing the kerosene lantern in a single motion, plunging the cabin into gray, stormy shadows. "Thorn!" a voice bellowed from outside, barely audible over the torrential rain. Silas crept to the shattered window, peering through the boarded-up lower half. Through the sheets of rain, standing at the edge of the tree line, was Marcus Riggins. He was soaked to the bone, his expensive suit ruined by mud. Behind him stood 5 heavily armed mercenaries. They had made it up the trail before the mudslide washed it away, and now they were all trapped on the peak together. "I know the trail is gone," Riggins screamed, waving a soaked piece of parchment in the air. "There's no way off this mountain for a woman in her condition. Sign the deed over to me, Thorn, and my men will help you dig a path down so you can get her to a doctor. Keep the land, and you can dig a grave for her yourself." Inside the cabin, Eleanor bit down on her lip until it bled, stifling a scream as a massive contraction tore through her. The pain was blinding, a primal, all-consuming agony that made the gunfire outside seem trivial. Silas looked back at his wife, writhing in agony on the bed. His eyes were wide with a desperate, trapped fury. "Sign it!" Riggins yelled, signaling his men. 2 of them stepped forward, leveling their rifles at the cabin door. "You have 1 minute before we burn you out in the rain." Silas's jaw locked. He looked at the deed he had fought 8 years to protect. He looked at the mountain he loved. Then he looked at Eleanor, her face pale, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. There was no choice. The land meant nothing without her. Silas dropped his Winchester. He reached into his coat, pulling out the heavy iron key to the lockbox where he kept the legal papers. "No!" Eleanor gasped, her voice ragged. She grabbed his wrist with astonishing strength. "Do not give it to him. He will kill us anyway to leave no witnesses." "I have to try," Silas rasped, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I can't lose you." "You won't," she hissed, her gray eyes burning with fierce, unbreakable resolve. "Fight them, Silas. Fight!" Silas looked into the eyes of his warrior wife. He nodded once. He picked up the Winchester, racked the lever, and kicked the heavy oak door wide open. He didn't surrender. He came out firing. The clearing erupted into a chaotic, deafening crossfire. Silas dove behind the thick, overturned wagon in the yard, his rifle barking in the rain. He hit 1 mercenary in the chest, sending him sprawling into the mud. But it was 5 against 1. Bullets chewed the wood of the wagon to splinters. Silas was pinned down, trapped in the crossfire. He fired again, his hammer clicking on an empty chamber. He reached for his Colt, but a bullet grazed his thigh, dropping him to one knee in the mud. Riggins saw his chance. Drawing a sleek, silver-plated revolver, the land baron sprinted across the muddy clearing, bypassing Silas entirely. Riggins headed straight for the open cabin door. He knew Silas's weakness. He didn't need to kill the mountain man. He just needed to put a gun to the pregnant wife's head. "Eleanor!" Silas roared in pure, unadulterated terror, struggling to his feet, his leg bleeding heavily. He was too far away. He wasn't going to make it. Riggins reached the porch, his boots thudding against the wet wood. He stepped through the doorway into the dim cabin, a cruel, triumphant smile twisting his lips. He raised his silver revolver toward the bed. But the bed was empty. Riggins froze, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Looking for a helpless woman, Marcus?" A cold, aristocratic voice whispered from the floor. Riggins looked down. Eleanor Thorne was propped up against the heavy iron stove, her legs splayed, her dress soaked in rain, and her own blood. She was in the absolute agonizing climax of labor, her body shaking with tremors, but her hands were perfectly steady. She had dragged herself across the floor. Resting on her bent knee, aimed squarely at Marcus Riggins's chest, was the heavy barrel of the lever-action repeater. Riggins's eyes widened in shock. He tried to swing his revolver down. Eleanor didn't blink. She squeezed the trigger. The deafening roar of the rifle in the enclosed cabin was absolute. The heavy-caliber bullet took Riggins dead center in the shoulder, the kinetic force lifting the man off his feet and throwing him backward out the door. He hit the muddy porch with a sickening crunch, his silver revolver clattering uselessly away, screaming in agony. Seeing their employer blasted out the door by a pregnant woman, and facing a wounded, enraged Silas Thorne who was now advancing on them with a drawn Colt, the remaining mercenaries broke. They threw down their rifles, backing away into the storm, raising their hands in surrender. Silas didn't shoot them. He kicked Riggins's weapon off the porch, ignoring the groaning, bleeding land baron. Silas threw himself through the doorway, sliding to his knees on the floor beside Eleanor. She dropped the smoking rifle, her head falling back against the iron leg of the stove. A massive, world-shattering contraction seized her, tearing a raw, guttural scream from her throat. "Silas!" she cried out, her fingers digging into his wet shirt like claws. "I'm here! I'm here!" Silas frantically dragged her away from the stove, pulling her into his arms, ignoring the blood and the mud. The siege was over, but the true battle for their lives had just reached its apex. "The baby," Eleanor sobbed, her aristocratic composure entirely shattered by the primal force of nature tearing through her. "Silas, it's coming, now!" The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, the world narrowed down to the space between Silas and Eleanor. Silas didn't waste a single second on Marcus Riggins. The land baron lay groaning on the muddy porch, clutching his shattered shoulder, his silver revolver lost in the deluge. Silas stepped over him, grabbed the heavy oak door and slammed it shut, throwing the iron latch. He barred the world, the war, and the rain outside. He slid to his knees on the blood-slicked floorboard, scooping Eleanor into his arms. She was terrifyingly pale, her skin clammy, her breath coming in rapid, ragged pants. He carried her to the large bed near the hearth, laying her gently against the pillows. "I cannot... Silas, I cannot breathe," Eleanor gasped, her fingers tangling in the heavy wool of his shirt. Another contraction seized her, bowing her spine off the mattress. A feral, agonizing cry tore from her throat, drowning out the thunder. Panic, cold and absolute, gripped Silas's chest. The ghosts of 8 years ago screamed in his ears, the blood, the cold, the helplessness. He was a man who could kill a cougar with a knife, who could fell a pine tree with an axe, but his massive, scarred hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the clean linens. "Silas!" Eleanor's voice was a sharp, commanding crack, cutting straight through his rising terror. He snapped his head up, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers. Despite the unimaginable pain tearing her body apart, her gray eyes were fiercely lucid. She was not fading. She was fighting. "Look at me," she ordered, her chest heaving, sweat plastering her dark hair to her cheeks. "I am not a ghost. I am not Sarah. I am Eleanor Thorne, and I am not leaving you on this mountain alone. Do you hear me?" The phantom grip of the past shattered. Silas took a deep, shuddering breath, the terror receding, replaced by a fierce, unshakable focus. He looked at the woman who had just shot a man to save his life. She wasn't delicate glass. She was forged steel. "I hear you," Silas rasped. He stripped off his gun belt and plunged his blood-stained hands into the basin of carbolic acid and boiled water he had prepared hours ago. "I'm right here, Eleanor. I'm not going anywhere." The next 2 hours were a brutal, blinding test of endurance. The cabin echoed with Eleanor's screams, the sound blending with the howling wind and the torrential rain battering the roof. Silas stayed anchored beside her, his large hands guiding, supporting, and bracing her. He murmured low, steady words of encouragement, his voice a deep, vibrating rumble that kept her tethered to the earth when the pain threatened to drag her under. "One more," Silas urged, his own face slick with sweat and soot, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "You're almost there, my brave girl. Give it to me. Push." Eleanor threw her head back, her teeth bared, her hands gripping Silas's forearms so hard her nails broke his skin. She poured every ounce of her remaining strength, every shred of her Boston pride, and every drop of her mountain-forged resilience into one final world-shattering push. Suddenly the pressure vanished. Eleanor collapsed back against the sweat-soaked pillows, her chest heaving, her eyes fluttering shut. For a terrifying, agonizing span of 3 seconds, the cabin was dead silent. The rain seemed to stop. Silas stopped breathing. Then it came. A sharp, indignant, and miraculously loud cry pierced the heavy air of the cabin. Silas dropped to his knees at the foot of the bed. His massive, scarred hands that had built a homestead from nothing and dealt death to his enemies, trembled as they lifted the tiny, squalling, blood-slicked infant. He worked quickly, clearing the baby's airway with a clean cloth and tying off the cord with practiced, albeit shaking, precision. He wrapped the infant in a pristine linen sheet, the softest fabric he owned. Eleanor forced her heavy eyelids open. Her vision was blurred with exhaustion and tears. She looked at her husband, kneeling in the dim light of the lantern. His dark hair was matted with sweat, his face smeared with gunpowder and mud, but it was his eyes that made her breath catch. Silas Thorne, the terrifying feral mountain man who had not shed a tear in 8 years, was weeping. Silent, heavy tears tracked through the grime on his scarred cheeks as he cradled the tiny bundle against his broad chest. "Silas?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely a rasp. She remembered the freezing barn in Silver Creek. She remembered the cold, transactional bargain, the ruthless test he had laid before her. "I need to know you won't snap. Will you give me sons?" "Is it a boy?" she asked softly. Silas slowly lifted his head. He looked down at the screaming, red-faced infant in his arms, and then up at the woman who had brought light back into his dead world. A smile, a real, profound, breathtaking smile, broke across his hardened face, transforming the jagged scar into a roadmap of survival. "No," Silas choked out, his voice thick with a joy so immense it seemed to fill the entire cabin. He stood up and carefully, reverently, placed the bundled infant onto Eleanor's chest. "It's a girl," he whispered, brushing a damp lock of hair from Eleanor's forehead. "A daughter. Our daughter." Eleanor looked down at the tiny, perfect face, the shock of dark hair, the small fists waving furiously in the cold air. Tears spilled hot and fast down her cheeks. She wrapped her tired arms around the baby, pulling her close to the warmth of her skin. "But the land," Eleanor murmured, looking up at him through her tears. "Riggins, the judge. You said you needed an heir." A son. Silas knelt beside the bed, wrapping his massive arms around both his wife and his newborn daughter. He pressed his face against Eleanor's temple, inhaling the scent of her sweat and the sweet metallic tang of life. "I was a fool," Silas said fiercely. "I thought a legacy was a name on a deed. I thought it was a son to plow the dirt. But I was wrong." He reached out, his rough, calloused thumb gently stroking the impossibly soft cheek of his daughter. The baby instantly quieted, turning her tiny head toward his enormous hand. "A legacy isn't what you leave behind, Eleanor. It's what you build," Silas continued, his storm-gray eyes burning with absolute, unwavering certainty. "And this girl, she is going to inherit this mountain. She will learn to read the weather and track a elk, and she will read your books and speak your languages. She will have your unbreakable spine and your fierce, terrifying mind. I don't need a son to hold my land. I need a daughter with her mother's fire." Eleanor let out a watery, exhausted laugh, leaning her head against his broad shoulder. The storm outside was finally beginning to break. The heavy rain slowed to a steady rhythmic drumming against the roof. The siege was over. The war was won. 3 years later, the Montana autumn was a masterpiece of spun gold and crisp, biting air. The lodgepole pines cast long, dark shadows across the expanded clearing of the Thorne homestead. Eleanor Thorne stepped out onto the wide, newly built wooden porch. She wore a tailored riding skirt and a crisp white blouse, her dark hair pinned back elegantly, though a few stray strands escaped in the mountain breeze. She was no longer too thin, and her face held no trace of the haunted, desperate woman who had fallen into the mud of Silver Creek. She radiated a quiet, unyielding power. She held a small, weathered wooden box in her hands. She walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the property. The barn had been rebuilt larger and stronger than before. The corral was full of healthy, fat draft horses. Down in the valley, Marcus Riggins was currently serving his 3rd year in the Territorial Penitentiary for attempted murder and arson, a conviction secured when a very pregnant, very articulate Boston woman had marched into the federal marshal's office in Helena and testified with terrifying precision. But Eleanor's eyes were not on the valley. They were on the chopping block near the tree line. Silas sat on a massive pine stump. The jagged scar on his face was still there, but the feral, haunted emptiness in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, enduring peace. He was patiently holding a long piece of pliable hickory wood. Standing between his knees was a 3-year-old girl with dark, unruly hair and eyes the color of a winter storm. She was wearing a tiny pair of canvas trousers and a miniature sheepskin coat. "Hold the knife steady, Matilda," Silas rumbled, his massive hands gently guiding his daughter's small fingers over the wooden handle of a dull carving blade. "Let the grain of this wood do the work. Don't force it." "Like this, Papa?" the little girl asked, her brow furrowed in intense, scholarly concentration that was the mirror image of her mother's. "Exactly like that, little bird," Silas praised, pressing a kiss to the top of her dark head. Eleanor smiled, a profound warmth expanding in her chest. She walked down the porch steps and crossed the yard, approaching the large stone fire pit where they boiled water for laundry. The embers were glowing hot from the morning's chores. She stopped at the edge of the fire. She opened the weathered wooden box. Inside sat 7 faded, wrinkled pieces of parchment, too tall, too sharp-tongued. Lacks the necessary domestic grace, too much of a liability. Eleanor pulled the letters out. For years she had carried them as a brand of shame, a constant reminder of her own perceived worthlessness. They had dictated her fears, her insecurities, and her desperate choices. She looked at Silas, who had looked up from the carving lesson. He watched her, his storm-gray eyes filled with a quiet, absolute adoration. He knew exactly what she was holding. He didn't say a word. He just smiled, a small, proud curving of his lips. Eleanor looked back at the letters. She didn't feel anger anymore. She didn't feel shame. She felt nothing but a distant, fleeting pity for the men who had written them. With a smooth, deliberate motion, Eleanor tossed the 7 letters into the glowing embers. The dry parchment caught instantly. The flames curled the edges, turning the cruel words black, then orange, then reducing them to nothing more than fragile, weightless ash that drifted up into the crisp mountain air. Silas stood up, lifting Matilda onto his broad shoulders. He walked over to the fire pit, wrapping his free arm around Eleanor's waist, pulling her flush against his side. "Gone?" he asked softly. "Gone," Eleanor confirmed, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. She looked out over the vast, untamed expanse of the Rocky Mountains, the land that belonged to them, the home they had built from blood, snow, and fire. She had arrived in the West as a cast-off, a joke in a muddy street. But she had learned that a woman's worth was not determined by the men who walked away from her, but by the fire she possessed within herself. Every man had refused her, leaving her for the one man strong enough to realize she was the only thing worth fighting for, 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 worth fighting for.